roughly what I want to cover is something about the psyche. So you see the word the soul there, and we tend to think of something associated with Dementors and Harry Potter or something like that. But the word soul comes from psyche, or psyche, the Greek word for that characteristic form of living that we see in human beings. Actually, a cognate of that word they applied to all creatures. It's just that the souls of something like a tree were kind of slightly more boring. Then I want to talk a little bit about John Hillings Jackson, one of the founders of neurological approaches to both neurology and psychiatry. He published equally in The Lancet, the British Medical Journal, and the British Journal of Psychiatry, and became one of the founders of the National Hospital for Nervous and Mental Diseases in London. It so happens that the things he wrote at the end of the 19th century are one of the most helpful ways of looking at cognitive function even now. I want to say something about embodied cognition because it helps us make sense of some of the more recent non-pharmacological research. And that brings me to a topic which has become very important in contemporary cognitive science and philosophy, which is the idea of autopoiesis, or self-making. The idea that a system doesn't just work from the bottom up by the end result of a lot of minor mechanisms going on, but actually imposes a top-down organisation on itself. And one of the most quintessentially obvious systems that does that is the human nervous system. But actually, it's a constant in the animal kingdom. If you think of embryology, then somehow or other those genetically identical cells that formed your big toe also formed your eye. But as I say to my students, if anyone pokes your eye out, don't cut off your big toe and put it in your eye socket and think you're going to see again. So genetics has got something working with it that makes a lot of the most important differences we see in human function. That brings us on to the topic of cerebral connectivity, and that brings us on to a completion of the circle by returning to one of the most characteristic features of the human psyche, which is what we call consciousness, a topic that wasn't even named in Aristotle's day. So Aristotle had no word for consciousness, none of the Greeks did. It's a later invention. So what did he say? Well, interestingly, he said we are souls. We think of ourselves as having souls, but that's not true. You don't have a soul like you have a handbag, you are a soul. Can't take your soul and give it to somebody else, sell it on the market. Well, not literally. Metaphorically, we know it happens all the time. But you are a soul. You have an integration and activity that's absolutely characteristic of you and makes you a living being among other living beings, a living being who, once those other living beings get to identify you and associate certain identifying things with you, they're not going to mistake for any other of its kind, even though there may be huge similarities. So Aristotle tries to get this through in more than one way. One of the remarks he uses is the soul is to the body as sight is to the eye. Now if you think about your eye, and you think about what it does, you immediately realise that if you were to cut the eye open and look inside it, without knowing what it does in a whole creature who uses sight, you'd figure out it had something to do with light, but you wouldn't quite know what. It's only when you hook the eye up to all the rest of the system that you see it's actually a system for picking up events before they hit you in the face. So it's really important. If, you know, one of the terms that was coined early on in cognitive psychology was cognition is anticipation. If you haven't got sight, and you haven't got sight suitably elevated above the sources of information relevant to what you're about to encounter, you're going to get surprises. You're going to get a lot of surprises. And you're only going to be able to deal with them the moment you can sort of more or less touch them. But if you have got sight, then you're going to have a crucial gap, actually a huge gap in neurological terms, between becoming aware that something is about to affect you and actually being affected by it. That's what the soul does. That's what sight is. It's having that crucial ability to monitor what's going on in the world in such a way as you can do something about it. And Aristotle says, well, the soul is like that. Now, what does he mean? Well, sight takes us beyond the realm of what we can immediately touch to what we're about to touch. The soul has a number of other capacities: memory, anticipation of the future, the ability to learn from other people what is about to happen or what happens around here sometimes, and to factor all those things into the way you organise your behaviour. And we are incredibly good at that. Whether we think of it this way or not, we have all kinds of ways of decentering our souls. So memory functions, for instance. Well, one of the things I tell my students is, look, if you want to give an older person a really good present, give them a key rack to hang up inside their door. Because then they're always going to put their keys in the same place. And then, when they've got an urgent appointment, they're not going to have to think, where did I leave my keys? Because the keys will always be just inside the door. And so they'll get to the appointment on time. So they won't be playing cognitive catch-up when they get to the appointment. And they won't be anxious or stressed. They won't be damaging their neurons through those circulating stress hormones and mRNA fragments that are going to go around their body. And they'll actually have a lot more joy. They'll do stuff better. And you can do all that for them, not by spending $1 million, $1,000, whatever, dollars on some fancy technology, but just by giving them a key rack. So find a nice one, says something important, you make one and give it to them. And of course, this is just one way of supporting living in your own home. We do it all the time. I carry an important bit of my memory around in my pocket. My colleagues who've moved beyond tree killing to the internet to do their memorising tell me I'm old-fashioned, but it kind of works for me. Keeping a bit of my brain in my pocket is a really good thing for me, as a matter of fact. I once had a neuroscientist say to me, come on, let's get real here. Nothing is going on in your brain that isn't contained inside your head and covered by the second law of thermodynamics. Energy in equals energy out, more or less. And I said, really? Fortunately, I happened to be wearing my memory stick around my neck. I said, what about this? That's not inside my head. But I tell you, if I didn't have it, I couldn't give this lecture. So, all the time, we decenter our cognitive processes. We hang them up in the world around us. When we're moving in a structured world that we've had a part in designing, we move a lot better than we're moving in a world that somebody else has designed, not necessarily with our needs in mind. And of course, the older you get and the more streamlined your cognitive pathways through the brain become, the less you are able to re-accommodate them to meet an unfamiliar or alien environment. And we heard this morning about the alienness of many care environments. Aristotle had something to say about it. He said we're all born with a first nature. It equips us to do certain things that largely follows from our, he didn't know this, but largely follows from what we inherit. He didn't have the term genes. They hadn't invented that fiction at the time. It is, of course, a fiction. There are significant changes in DNA that have significant effects on our metabolism, but the idea of a gene as a hereditable feature that is passed on through DNA changes is itself a highly sophisticated scientific construct rather than a reality. But on the basis of that first nature, we develop a second nature. We have relationships, we move ourselves away from naivety or innocence to experience, we become capable of action. And all those things separate us from our animal forebears, which is why most of our preclinical experiments have significant limitations when we try to carry them over into the clinical setting. So let's get on to John Hewlings-Jackson, because he's going to tell us something very neurological about all this. There he is, or a picture of him. We shouldn't mistake the representation for the reality, of course. He is now dead. He died about 1914. But he did most of his writing in the 1880s, and that's where he said most of the things that I'm going to tell you about him. He noticed that as human beings, we go from a relatively limited range of responses to the world around us, closely tied to our immediate environment, which is what we see in the animals, to something a whole lot more complex. Something in which we overlay that pattern of responses with a different set of patterns, taking account of wider and wider sources of information and building them into the way we react to any given situation. If we're denied those sources of information, we cannot build adaptive patterns of responding to the environment, which is going to be relevant to a point I'm going to make later about 23 hours and 55 minutes. You might be thinking about how much conversation a person in a care facility gets in any given day. What we do is we build what he calls reservoirs of energy, or sources of productive activity in the world, which is what a reservoir of energy is, in resisting positions, a knowledge of those things we ought not to do in certain situations because they're going to land us in problems. I ought not to go out of my door, or the door of the place I currently am, without taking careful note of the things that cue me into the fact that this is the door I should be going into. I ought not to take my first 2 turns in direction after leaving that door without noticing at those turning points significant landmarks that I can later recall. If I build in these points of resistance to my unfolding activity of going on a journey, then when I come to retrace my steps, I've of course already built in to my procedural, semantic, the divisions are not as real as a lot of experiments make them out to be. I've built into my memory functions a set of important cues and clues, which will mean that I can retrace my steps and end up where I started off from. In this respect, the whole body is the organ of mind. As we are walking on any given journey, we're taking in all kinds of impressions that we're not making explicitly conscious through cognitive work, and those add in to the associative complex that we build up as the journey unfolds. So that's why if you suddenly find yourself at a point in a journey where you don't know where you are, that might first hit you as there's something's gone wrong. I thought I was going back to where I came from, but I shouldn't be here. And you might not know exactly why, but only by cognitively rehearsing how you got back to where you now are from where you went to, and the points at which it could have gone wrong, do you really figure out how to undo the mistake and get back on track again. Now actually, this is all quite well understood in the embodied cognition literature, or in theory at least, not in practice so much. The whole idea that as a result of neural evolution, we have this increasingly structured neural net, some bits of which we make consciously explicit and others we don't. And a lot of that depends upon how actively we use the information that we've picked up. So one of the first things we do for our medical students is teach them not just to sit in lectures and expose themselves to what's written in their books, but to do active cognitive work with it, to design themselves multiple choice questions, to be reiterating and reinterpreting, paraphrasing in their own words, annotating, adding in comments in the margins of their texts which would link them to other places. Whatever they do, it doesn't quite matter exactly what it is, but they've got to be actively cognitively working with the information or it will not be theirs. And when they come to call it back to consciousness, they will not be able to.